Hey everyone, Israel is currently in a war against the terror organization Hamas, and we know how hard it can be to keep up with all the news. So if you haven't had the time to stay on top of the latest developments out of Israel, we're here for you. I'm Ladar Gavelazi, and this is ILTV's Weekly Review. Day 145 of the war, and the IDF has begun efforts to evacuate Gazan civilians from combat areas ahead of an expected move into the remaining Hamas stronghold in Rafah. And the army has also arrested Hamas gunmen attempting to escape the battlefield under cover of the civilian population. ILTV's Steve Leibovitz reports.
The army has begun the organized evacuation of Gazan civilians out of harm's way in Rafah ahead of a planned IDF operation into the last remaining Hamas-held city. At the same time, forces arrested a number of terrorists who tried to flee under the cover of the civilian population. A number of Hamas operatives were also eliminated after they were identified observing Israeli forces. IDF spokesman Daniel Hagari said that the war in Gaza will end in Rafah, but not before some conditions are met to ensure a successful operation in the densely populated area, where there are some 1.4 million people. The IDF spokesman said that the objectives for Gaza set by the cabinet are ambitious and will take time to achieve. Meanwhile, the IDF is continuing mop-up operations in and around Khan Yunis and in Zaytun neighborhood in Gaza City. Dozens of Hamas operatives were killed and weapons recovered. The IDF conducted operations against Hamas infrastructure and terror operatives in the Zaytun area in Gaza City. Israeli forces located a weapons manufacturing facility and rocket launchers used by the terrorist group and identified a number of terrorists inside a tunnel shaft, which they promptly destroyed. The terrorists were eliminated. At the same time, a major tunnel was uncovered connecting North and South Gaza.
צק"ח הנחל ויחידות ההנדסה השונות עסוקים בעת הזאת למצוא את רשת המנהרות שמחברת בין צפון הרצועה לבין דרום הרצועה והולכות מתחת למסדרון הקרקעי אותו צק"ח הנחל תופס. אנחנו יכולים לראות כאן תוואי אסטרטגי אמיתי של החמאס שמחבר בין צפון הרצועה לבין דרומה. הצק"ח ימשיך, יאתר ויחפש את המנהרות האלה.
The heavy cross-border exchanges are continuing daily between the IDF and Hezbollah terrorists on the Israeli-Lebanese border, with no end in sight. But there is speculation that a potential pause in fighting in Gaza could also bring at least a temporary quiet in the north. More from ILTV's Steve Leibovitz.
Hezbollah fired heavy-caliber Birkin rockets at northern Israel. Drones targeted Kiryat Shmona and military positions near the border. Israeli warplanes targeted a house in the southern border town of Blida. IDF artillery shelled Hezbollah assets in the southern Lebanon border town of Kafr Kela. Israeli warplanes struck Hezbollah launch pads and infrastructure in the Blat Mountain area, and an observation post was targeted in the Aita al-Shab area. While there is no end in sight in the cross-border exchanges, Israeli officials are saying that a deal for a pause in Gaza fighting could lead to an agreement between Lebanon and Israel. Officials believe that during a pause in Gaza fighting, Hezbollah will give Lebanon the green light to engage in serious negotiations for a diplomatic arrangement which will allow the return of residents to their homes and push Hezbollah 10 kilometers north of the border. Meanwhile, the IDF continues preparing for the potential need for a ground operation to push Hezbollah back from the border by force if a diplomatic solution is not found. The troops say they are ready when called.
Personally, I feel like it's what I have to do. There's no question about it. Like, this is what we have to do. We know there is a threat. We see them, we hear them, we know what they want to do. So there's absolutely no question. There's difficulties, obviously, with being here for so long, but absolutely no question about it.
Since Hezbollah initiated cross-border attacks in October, at least 276 people have been killed on the Lebanese side of the border, most of them Hezbollah terrorists. On the Israeli side, 10 soldiers and 6 civilians have been killed.
As Israel continues the battle against Hamas and the Gaza Strip, U.S. and U.K. forces are battling the Iranian regime-backed Houthis in Yemen, who have been striking international ships in the Red Sea, disrupting international shipping routes.
The Houthis, a proxy of the Islamic Republic of Iran, have continued to strike international ships since October 7th in solidarity with Hamas in Gaza. In the last 45 days, they fired at 45 commercial and naval vessels and also struck the U.S.-owned bulk carrier MV Sea Champion, which was on its way to Yemen with humanitarian aid for Yemen.
تؤكد القوات المسلحة اليمنية على أنها ستواجه التصعيد الأمريكي البريطاني بالمزيد من العمليات العسكرية النوعية ضد كافة الأهداف المعادية في البحرين الأحمر والعربي دفاعاً عن بلدنا وشعبنا وأمتنا.
In response to the ongoing attacks, the UK and US have intensified targeted strikes against the Houthis, hitting 18 targets in multiple locations across Yemen. The strikes targeted Houthi suicide drones, air defense systems, weapon storage facilities, and helicopters. On Saturday, the US also shot down an anti-ship ballistic missile launched into the Gulf of Aden from Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen, likely targeting the Torm Thor, a US flag-owned and operated tanker. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin stated that the strikes aim to further disrupt and degrade the capabilities of the Iranian-backed Houthi militia to conduct their destabilizing and reckless attacks against US and international vessels.
With the Northern Front in a continued state of war thanks to Hezbollah, a proxy of the Islamic Republic of Iran, there's no question that this regime in Iran is itching for conflict with Israel. Here to speak with us about the role of Iran in this war is Jonathan Shanzer from Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today. Just to start, we've seen continuous low-level escalation on the Northern Front with the proxy of the regime itself, Hezbollah. Is Iran just biding its time in this conflict?
It's a good question, Emily. I think we're trying to figure out exactly what the intentions of the regime are right now. Just to be clear, what's happening in Lebanon is not a low-level conflict. I mean, we are talking about hundreds and hundreds of attacks, including some direct hits on Israeli military targets. And so the Israelis are now attacking deeper and deeper into Lebanon itself, taking out strategic assets belonging to Hezbollah. And that all begs the question, what does Iran want? Is Iran trying to activate Hezbollah so that there is a second front that Israel has to fight alongside what's going on in Gaza? By the way, that doesn't even get to the attacks that we've seen against American forces by Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, and of course what the Houthis are doing in Yemen. We call this the Ring of Fire strategy, and that is clear. This is what the Iranian regime has activated. They have definitely deployed that Ring of Fire. But I think there are questions now about whether this is all designed to destroy Israel, right, where they're trying to carry out attacks continuously from all angles, or whether this is a distraction from something much more insidious, which would be, of course, a dash to a nuclear weapon. And right now, it's very difficult to discern what's what.
Now, do you believe that there is a wide-scale plan on the part of the Iranian regime to commit further massacres, similar to October 7th, whether against Israel or against the Western world, and what can be done to prevent it?
Well, for sure, I think the capabilities are there as it relates to Hezbollah, the so-called Radwan forces that are active primarily in southern Lebanon. This has been the fear of Israel since October 7th, that Hezbollah could carry out an attack similar or perhaps even worse than what we saw on October 7th at the hands of Hamas and their ground forces. So that is something that we continue to watch. The drone attacks and the rocket attacks by the Shiite militias, I think, may be the extent of it as we see their ability to attack the West. But I would argue that what we're seeing out of the Houthis right now is potentially even more worrying than any of the above, because what they've done is they've shut off the shipping lanes in the Red Sea. There are reports today of attacks on the communications cables between the Middle East and Africa, which is now having an impact on Europe as well. This is having a significant economic impact and, of course, the security impact that has forced the U.S., the UK, the Israelis, and others to get involved.
Now, when it comes to the Houthis, as you've mentioned several times, we've seen some disturbing demonstrations, even in the West, of people chanting in support of the Houthis. Now, we know the Iranian regime has been very active on the cyber front as well. Do you see this activity as something connected to the Iranian regime in any sort of formal way? Or is this more a war of information that Iran is waging through media and social media in order to advance the interests of the regime?
I think it's both. I mean, to be honest, we can see an information operation that the Iranians have been running since day one, where they're trying to pull together what they would call their axis of resistance in the media space, right? Not just the terrorist groups that they coordinate, but also all the different, supporters and backers of the regime, the Islamists around the world. By the way, Muslim Brotherhood, which is the largest Islamist group in the world, they're pretty much behind the regime in Iran, despite those sectarian differences, despite that Sunni Shiite divide. And so what they're trying to do right now, from what we can tell, is to organize with one voice all of this opposition to Israel and to the United States, while also coordinating the violent activities of these groups. And they're getting that support on college campuses, on Main Street America, in European capitals. And obviously, they're doing a pretty good job of it. And it's real cause for concern.
So Israel and the U.S. have both struck Iranian targets throughout the Middle East, in particular in Syria and Iraq. Are these strikes sufficient to deter the regime? And if not, what must the Western allied countries, will say, what must they do?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, actually, since the Iranian proxies out of Iraq were able to successfully target 3 servicemen in Jordan, the U.S. announced that it was going to respond. And then it did, and took out a number of targets associated with both militias in Iraq and Syria. And since that time, we've actually seen a quieting of both fronts, which I think is actually a very positive sign. I'm not sure that it's going to last in perpetuity. I'm fairly certain we're going to see these 2 proxy fronts heat up again. There's about 12.5 different Shiite militias aligned with Iran, and the odds of them staying quiet are quite low. But I think the bigger question is, how do you deter the Houthis, right? They're the ones that continue to carry out the more serious of these attacks. And what I think all of this shows is that the regime has multiple tools that it can deploy against the West, against Israel, against the wider forces of the region in favor of stability and pragmatism. And right now, the U.S. seems to not have a lot of answers. The Iranians seem to be dominating this space. And even with the curbing of some of that violence out of Iraq and Syria, it looks as if we've lost control of the region. And this is a major concern for the United States.
Well, Jonathan Shanzer, Foundation for Defense of Democracies, thank you so much for your insight. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too.
Experience the power of truth with ILTV News. If you're looking for quality content and captivating visuals, join our news community and become an integral part of our team as we embark on a mission to unveil the real Israel, dismantling the web of lies and misinformation that surround reporting on Israel. By subscribing to ILTV News, you will not only have access to the latest updates, but you will also amplify our message, creating a ripple effect that carries the truth far and wide. Subscribe today and help reshape the narrative. Available on the web, Android, and Apple.
We open with a terrorist attack on a highway east of Jerusalem. 3 Palestinian terrorists opened fire on motorists during rush hour traffic on Highway 1 near Ma'ale Adumim. 1 Israeli was killed and others wounded before the terrorists were neutralized. More from ILTV's Steve Leibowitz.
The terrorists took advantage of morning rush hour, opening fire on cars on Highway 1 near Ma'ale Adumim, killing 1 man and wounding several others. Police say 3 Palestinian terrorists carried out the attack near the Az-Zaim checkpoint between Jerusalem and Ma'ale Adumim. The trio opened fire with automatic weapons as Israelis waited in traffic while heading toward Jerusalem a few hundred meters before the checkpoint. 2 of the gunmen were shot by security forces at the scene, while the 3rd initially fled before being shot a short while later following police searches of the area.
שוטרים שהיו פה, גם שוטרי תנועה של מחוז ש"י שהיו פה בפעילות והם מאבטחים אזרחים, פותחים באש לעבר המחבלים, הורגים 2 מחבלים, מחבל שלישי כרגע פצוע אנוש. מהאירוע הזה יש לנו אזרח הרוג, מספר פצועים נוספים במצב קשה עד בינוני. כרגע הזירה נסרקת, אנחנו בסריקות פה במקום, מנסים לפתוח את הציר למעבר של אזרחים לכיוון ירושלים.
The dead terrorists have been identified as Palestinians, and according to an initial probe, 2 of them are from Bethlehem. They came in 2 separate vehicles, fully armed, with an M16 rifle, a Carlo submachine gun, grenades, and cartridges. They exited their vehicles and began to shoot toward people sitting inside their cars. The wounded were taken to Hadassah and Shari Tzedek hospitals for treatment. The wounded include 2 women aged 23 and 30, along with a 23-year-old man in critical condition, and 2 men aged 40 in moderate condition.
And as Israelis are trying to get back to a semblance of normal life after the October 7th massacre on Tuesday, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant warned that Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah are hoping to take advantage of the upcoming Muslim holy month of Ramadan to proceed to the second phase of October 7th and ignite the region. In past years, the month of Ramadan has seen an uptick in violence and terrorist attacks against Israelis. And so joining us now in the studio with more is Dean Eldan, the international spokesman for the Israel Police. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, I want to start with October 7th, and this was such a traumatic event for Israelis, and it really shook their sense of personal safety, of personal security. So I want to ask, what has the police been doing since that time to try and sort of restore the sense of security to the Israeli citizens?
So if I may, I want to go even a little further back because it's not just since then. It was on October 7th, the first day, when the police were essentially the bulletproof vest for our nation. They were the front lines when the terrorists made their way into Sderot, into the 22 different communities that were running from their houses even to battle the terrorists, many of them with just handguns. We know the iconic Nova Music Festival massacre, and there 22 police officers gave their life. And when we were taking the bodies out and identifying our heroes, many of them had no bullets left in their handgun, and they were fighting these terrorists till the very last bullet and saved, over 2,800 civilian lives. So when we're talking about the Israel police, that's their main focus. It's very different in its formation than, let's say, a police force in America, where they're dealing with primarily crime and protecting public order. Here, one of our top priorities is also terrorism. So year-round, that's our main focus throughout the country.
And we just had last week a terrorist attack in Jerusalem, and now we're approaching the month of Ramadan, where, in past years we've seen an uptick in violence. And just today, the leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, has called on Palestinians to storm the Al-Aqsa, to, inciting to violence, calling for terror attacks. What is the police doing to prepare or prevent, this type of violence?
So part of my job is also ensuring operational security. So you're going to have to excuse me, but I can't give necessarily our preparation plans and the things that we're focusing on. But like I said before, year-round our focus is public security, making sure that we're not just defending Jews, we're defending all of our civilians. We have many thousands, hundreds of thousands of Christians and Muslims in our country, amongst our police force as well. Don't forget, a lot of people overlook that the police in Jerusalem are, many of them, Muslims and Christians themselves. Our focus is defending, protecting our home, our civilians. Now, it's not just on us. I do want to say that it's also important for the public to be vigilant. We're in a time of war. It's not a secret. We've had to raise our readiness level and our training with different units, like the neighborhood watch that we have, that just completed a very big training session in Tel Aviv to be ready for any potential attack that might take place there. We go over different things like that, but the public needs to stay vigilant. If they see anything suspicious or they're concerned about anything, to call 100. It's the police emergency hotline number, and that's what we're there for. We're going to give it attention.
And, has there been any change when it comes to police policy in dealing with terrorists and dealing with terrorism, especially in the wake of October 7th?
Our policy is the same. We have a zero tolerance policy for terrorism, and essentially if a person is going to endanger the lives of one of our civilians, whether it's a resident or whether it's a tourist coming in, he's gambling with his own life, because we're going to do whatever it takes to defend our civilians and prevent further attacks from taking place. You mentioned the attack right outside of Jerusalem. The terrorist was stopped by our civilians and then also a police officer that was on his way to work. We might not be able to prevent every attack from taking place because there's lone wolf terrorists, there's different type of terrorism, but we are going to be there to react, and we are going to be there to defend our civilians. We are there for them.
And you mentioned sort of that civilians should stay vigilant during this time, especially during this time of war, but are there any specific instructions by the police to Israeli civilians? How, anything that they should be doing, especially now as we're approaching the month of Ramadan?
Listen, they need to educate themselves, first of all, but I'm not going to sit here and say that we should let terrorism dictate our lives. This is our nation, this is our home. People should feel free to move around. And like I said, also to keep in mind that we're in a time of war, to also not just against terrorism and the fact that they should alert the police if there's somebody suspicious, but to also keep in mind that we've seen rocket attacks still coming in from the north, from the south. Just last night, Ashkelon had a rocket attack and a vehicle was struck by a rocket. The public needs to also be made aware that if you're coming from abroad or if you're less familiar, to read up on the home front commands of, how many seconds you have to get to a bomb shelter, that you need to stay in that bomb shelter for 10 minutes, because we saw in places like Tel Aviv or also the south where 6-7 minutes afterwards, when the rocket was intercepted, that shrapnel fell right in the middle of a supermarket, fell right next to a car. People need to be made aware of these things. But again, this is our home, and terrorism is not going to dictate our lives. The police are going to be here for them. The IDF is going to be here for them, and that's what we do year round. The attacks that we do see, they're a drop in the bucket of the attacks that we've thwarted. And we're going to keep doing our job because we know that we're not just defending our people, we're also defending our families who live here. And that's why it's especially important to us.
All right, Dean Elsdon, thank you so much for coming into the studio and for all the work that you and the Israel police are doing.
Thank you, Lida.
After Brazil's President Lula made incendiary comments about Israel, the Brazilian people are responding and showing their support for Israel. Let's take a closer look.
Tens of thousands of Brazilians took to the streets in Sao Paulo for a rally in defiance of Brazilian President Lula's comments comparing Israel's war against Hamas to the Holocaust. Lula's comments were harshly condemned, and Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz summoned the Brazilian ambassador in response, taking him to Yad Vashem and demanding an apology from Lula. Former President Bolsonaro, a staunch supporter of Israel, attended the rally in Brazil, where he was seen waving an Israeli flag in solidarity. Many of the attendees were his staunch supporters. Bolsonaro has come under fire in the past year after losing the election and is currently being investigated by federal police for his role in the attacks on government buildings by his supporters following his election loss. Many of his supporters believe this election was stolen. Nonetheless, 6 blocks of Paulista Avenue were filled with his supporters yesterday, approximately 185,000 attendees, with thousands of Israeli flags clearly in sight to send a strong message against Lula's anti-Israel policies. Among the signs visible in the rally were those that read, "Brazilians want to tell the Jewish people that we are sorry." CNN Brazil reported that 83% of Brazilians polled strongly disagreed with President Lula's anti-Semitic comments. While Bolsonaro is ineligible to run for office again until 2030 due to his convictions of abuse of power, his supporters remain extremely outspoken and active, including on the issue of Israel.
For more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at ILTV.tv or download the ILTV Plus app. That's it for ILTV's weekly review. Stay safe and see you next week.